Hey everyone, welcome. I'm Marina Ormes, and I'm the founder of Astrology Heals at astrologyheals.com. And I've been doing a series called Countdown to 2022. And I've been reviewing for you some of the astrological insight into how we can understand better what's going to happen and why we are at this moment that we are in history, and the things that we're going through with the pandemic, with climate crisis, with social justice issues, with all kinds of things, worries about democracy. And so as I was looking at our astrology for 2022, one of the things that really jumped out to me was an eclipse that is going to be happening on our midterm election day. It's actually earlier in the day, on November 8th, which is our midterm elections. And I looked at the energy of the eclipse. It's quite interesting. And so I thought I wanted to go a little deeper into what's going on with that particular eclipse and with our country in general, and some of the things that we're going through. And so I invited my good friend, Sheri Hasan, who we go way back. We studied together with Stephen Forrest, and Sheri is just a fantastic astrologer. I love every time I chat with her. I get so excited because she's got such wonderful way of putting things and really is a deep thinker. So we're very compatible that way, and we really enjoy chatting together. Sheri has a podcast, and she has a weekly podcast. It's Karmic Evolutions, Astrologically Speaking, and it comes out on Thursdays at 11 a.m. Pacific time, 2 o'clock Eastern. And Sheri combines her accumulated knowledge of literature, mythology, the archetypes, psychology, and astrology to bring into greater consciousness your personal hero's journey through this lifetime. So welcome, Sheri. I'm so delighted to have you and to have this chat with you.
Thanks, Marina. I'm excited to be here, and I'm so glad that you decided to tackle this subject because I am someone who, I'm actually a former journalist. I worked for about 15 years early in my career in trade publishing, which is basically business publishing. And so I kind of cut my teeth on being aware of what's going on, in the news. And so a lot of the things that I talk about on my podcast are related to, as above, so below, looking at the heavenly energies, the movement of the planets, and then correlating it to what's going on in the collective, right? So I believe also, and I think you do too, that, as above, so below is, what's happening in the macrocosm, in the collective, is where we can take our cues, kind of, because then we can filter it down to our personal lives. And if those aspects or ingresses or, things that are happening in astrology or in basically astronomy too, right? We can see or tell the bigger symbolism of it to see if it's actually manifesting in our private lives. And for some of us, it will, because those same aspects and movements will be touching our natal charts. And for some of us, it won't be quite as profound, right? But at least we get a heads up. So I think it's real important to know what's going on in the collective and use astrology to help explain why. And then, can relate it to our own lives.
Yeah, absolutely. And that helps us to understand what we're experiencing also, and how we can respond to that, and how it relates to our own personal hero's journey, evolutionary journey, how we're learning and growing and becoming more of ourselves. And I think we're in these times where sometimes it feels kind of hopeless, right? Like,
oh yeah,
right.
Yeah. You know what keeps running through my mind, and I'm not a religious person, but I was raised with religion, but is Sodom and Gomorrah, right? Like, and I think about some of the quotes from the ancients, especially the Greeks, where it's like, everything is terrible, kids don't ever listen to their parents anymore, and it just throws you back to our generation where it's like, your parents telling you, we didn't get a car when we were 17 and we got a permit to drive, you guys are so lucky. We used to, what's the thing they post on Facebook, right? Your parents walking to school uphill both ways in the snow,
right. Over broken glass.
Exactly. Exactly. So, I guess it's generational, but it is easy to feel that this is a somewhat, I guess I would translate hopeless into transformational.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things I love about astrology is it gives us that perspective that everything is a cycle. We actually expect things to break down and fall apart at certain times in that cycle. There are multiple cycles going on at any given time. And some of that has to do right now in this bigger picture of, the years and decades that we're in, that really has to do with breakdown. And, but with breakdown, as we both know, it always comes rebirth. And so what does that look like? What could that look like? What are we becoming?
Yeah. And one of the things we say is break down to break through. Right. And I have a little saying, although I don't think it's original, but, in order to get from point A to point B, to get from one side to the other, you have to go through it. Attempts to go around it are not going to work, at least on a spiritual level,
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And that's how we work with the planets, right? With Pluto and Uranus, the breakthrough, the transformation, Neptune, and the bigger spiritual picture. So shall we take a look then at the eclipse chart? And I'd love,
as the Gophers you said in the old cartoon, let's.
Right on. Yes. Yeah. So what's happening in 2022? And I know, Sheri, you had some things to say about the shift in the lunar nodes and where the eclipses are going to fall in general. But also we're looking at, so for next year, this particular eclipse is a full moon. So it's a lunar eclipse. The moon happens to be within a degree of the planet Uranus during the eclipse. The sun is in Scorpio, the moon is in Taurus along with Uranus. It's in a T-square to the planet Saturn, which has been in an ongoing square to Uranus. And I talked about that in one of my videos, Saturn and Aquarius. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about this and the US and politics and.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, the first thing I think that's important is, and I think you've mentioned this on some of your previous videos, is that the Saturn-Uranus square is continuing throughout 2022. And, again, if you're aware of what's going out what's been going on out in the world, not only in the US, but also internationally, especially in Europe, there's been a lot of protests. It started even in May of 2020 with the George Floyd protests here on Black Lives Matter and things of that nature. And I'm going to say that I think it's going to shift to two things in this country, which is voting rights and the abortion issue. So, my aim is not to discuss my personal views, but just to look at what's happening, right? So as the Saturn-Uranus square completed, actually today,
Yeah.
well, we're pre-recording, but at the end of December, let's just say. So it doesn't mean it's over. And they will come back to within a degree of each other, as you mentioned, definitely by the election and the Scorpio new moon solar eclipse on November 8th. So the thing to keep in mind here is that social progressives versus those who want to stick with the status quo, and whether on a personal level, we want to stick with our old beliefs, right? As we move out of the south node of the moon, and the nodes of the moon, without going into a technical explanation, I will just say that I call them the transiting karmic nodal axis, right?
Yeah.
So the South Node always tells us the portal through which we entered into this lifetime if we're looking at your individual natal chart. But when it's moving in the sky, it's showing us the energies of the collective, right? So it's what Carl Jung would call the collective unconscious. So we're moving out of a 1.5 year period where the South Node was in Sagittarius, which means that the collective may unconsciously be exhibiting the things that they believe in. But as you and I know from our mentor, Stephen Forrest, it's oftentimes things that they're beliefs that no longer serve us.
Right.
But we may be righteous about them, okay? Because Sagittarius, which is ruled by Jupiter, encompasses the archetypes of higher law. It encompasses the religion. And when I think of the connection between religion and higher law, I think of the fact that it's the monotheistic religions that gave us the 10 Commandments, and the 10 Commandments really form the basis for all of Western legal systems, right? If it's immoral, thou shalt not kill or commit adultery and stuff like that, then we have laws that repeat that, because the collective had come to a point at a certain point in time, thousands of years ago, where it rose into consciousness, right? But at the other side of it is righteousness. Mm. And Jupiter and Sagittarius have a connotation with what the Greeks called hubris, which is arrogance or excessive arrogance. So we know that in the world around us, just to take the pandemic, for example, the pro-vaccine and the anti-vaxxers, I'm not even going to go into all the details, because again, you only need to flip on the news or pick up a newspaper anytime during this past year to see that, right? And what we've been called to do is to open up to new perspectives, which is the Gemini North Node. And the North Node is what we're working towards should we decide we would like to choose to manifest our highest destiny in this world. Again, on a personal level in the natal chart, and on a collective level in the transit charts. So, but the problem with Gemini energy too, as the North Node, is that it's perspective, right? And it's details. And we've had squares by Neptune, to Neptune, and some other things, and nodes have squared Neptunes over the past year or two. And so there's a lot of confusion, a lot of information that's disinformation, misinformation, and that's caused huge confusion. So as we move, and it will happen between the end of December and the middle, I think it's around January 18th, the nodes are going to shift. It depends on whether you use the mean node or true node. Let's not go there. That's too detailed. So it doesn't matter, because we're going to feel the energies at least starting by the beginning or into February of 2022. And when we move to a Scorpio South Node, what we know is that we're looking at a new archetype. And the Scorpio archetype is ruled by Pluto. Pluto is the sign of transformation and what I call evolution, right? And it tells us that in order to survive, we must adapt. And if we adapt to changing circumstances, because particularly the planet Uranus tells us that change is the only constant. That's as far as I understand, I'm not a scientist and whatever, but that's a physics principle, right? Things have to change. If they don't change, they harden, they fossilize, and then they become obsolete. So if we don't change, we won't see any forward progress that allows us to adapt to the changing circumstances around us and then to evolve. And if we evolve, then the logical assumption is we will thrive. So we can fossilize or we can adapt, evolve, and thrive, right? So, but Pluto Scorpio carries a very dark connotation. It's known as our shadow side, especially in Jungian psychological astrology. So the collective is going to move into a period over the next 18 months, starting at the beginning of 2022, where we are going to be called to say, let's go deep about our shadows, right? Mm-hmm. What is it that we don't want anyone else to know? Because the shadow side is basically the part of the unconscious that keeps repressed or hidden the things that society considers to be taboo. And Pluto has a particular connotation with the underworld, which again in mythology represents our unconscious. So what's buried in our unconscious that we are afraid to bring out into the light? Because if we bring it out, because we're afraid and we don't know that if we do bring it out into the light, revealing to others the things about which we're most ashamed, the things that we don't want anyone else to know, right?
Yeah.
But in doing so, because Pluto Scorpio is an alchemical archetype, with the evolutionary transformational process I was talking about is, and that's goes back to our point that it is particularly relevant that you have to go through it to come out on the other side, right? We have to face our shadow. And in doing so, we can manifest the material side of life, which is the Taurus North Node. So having, there are issues that are going to be prevalent, particularly in the financial realm, in the sexual realm, and in the beliefs that we hold about who we can trust. And when Pluto is involved or Scorpio is involved, the issue is trust. We're talking deep bonded loyalty. And these are fixed signs. We're moving from mutable to fixed. So the fixity there is like, I have to figure out, what do I trust in my life? Who do I trust in my life? And how can I use that trust to form loving, harmonious bonds with others, and particularly also to the earth, because Taurus is Venus's Taurus is Mother Earth. So we all know, again, I don't think I have to mention climate change and things of that nature, or hit you over the head with it. But how can we transform? Because we're moving out of the period where we've been asked to transform our beliefs by letting in new information and new data and shedding new light that gives us a new perspective. Now we're asked to go deep in 2022 in particular to say, okay, where can I root out my unconscious behaviors or the script that runs below the egoic, cognizant mind of what's the empirical, logical mind, right? And the way out is to move towards that harmony and serenity. The big key word for Taurus energy really is serenity. So, that's a big, big message. I noticed too that I just wanted to mention the winter solstice, which was on December 21st, of course, had a square of these transiting nodes still in Sagittarius and Gemini to Jupiter, just before Jupiter moved into Pisces from Aquarius. So I think that the collective right now, and many of us as part of the collective, we're all at varying degrees of consciousness, depending on our lives and, what we do and how we think and all that. There's confusion about in what we can place our faith. And so I want to mention that because the year starts that way. I know you've already talked about Jupiter conjoining Neptune in Pisces, so that'll be in the spring. And so I think it's a continuation of that energy because that can be a extremely useful spiritual energy. Okay.
We did have Jupiter going through Pisces for part of 2021 as well. So we've had Neptune in Pisces since 2011. So
but the combination of Jupiter and Neptune, especially a conjunction, which is when the two planets meet or appear to meet in the sky, is still referred to as a frictional aspect, even though it can play either way. It could play nice or it can present issues. So where are our dreams and our hopes and our wishes as we get through the first quarter of 2022, grounded enough to become concretely, physically manifest in the empirical world? Because if they're not grounded, it's all just fantasy. But the other side of that, like I said, is we can take the higher road and we can practice or incorporate or continue our meditations, our mindfulness practices. And I have a very strong belief, because I work a lot with creatives. I'm also a professional editor, so who helps people write their manuscripts for publishing. But the thing is that we can get easily confused by the mundane stuff. And if our ideas, like I said, aren't grounded, we can go off on the wrong track in terms of our spiritual nature. So we can be during this period, especially when Jupiter conjoins Neptune, conned by the gurus, you know, who aren't real and all that stuff. So it's real important, I think, to continue your meditative, mindful, and creative practices, journaling, you know, if it's writing, if it's art, if it's music, it doesn't matter. You don't have to be good at it, but it's a way to expel energies that are unwanted that lead to this fantastical thinking, because fantastical thinking is always a means to try to escape all of these hardships that we are under and have been for the past year and a half, right?
Yeah, and harnessing the power of the imagination to have a dream and a vision for what the future could be. And I think, you know, we're so much in this like dystopian mindset in a lot of ways, and a lot of our media, you know, sort of portray what the future is going to look like after the apocalypse. But what about what the future could look like if we solve some of these problems, if we take advantage of this opportunity to shift and change and transform? And
well, the interesting thing is that I liken Jupiterian energy, which is the ruler of Sagittarius and the ancient ruler of Pisces, to a helium balloon. Mm-hmm. And what I want to say is that by the Aries equinox, which is the spring equinox in March, on March 20th, now we see the shift of the transiting nodes now in Scorpio and Taurus. So the theme is shifted. They're going to be square to Saturn. And Saturn, I call the lead, block of lead. So when Saturn and Jupiter play nice together, you know, if you have a helium balloon and you let it go, right, it's going to go up. You know, your kids next to you, they let the balloon go, they're crying, right? But you can't get that balloon back, you know, or if you can, good luck to you. But, you know, so it's like taking that helium balloon as we start to come to this Jupiter-Neptune conjunction just a month before, and tying it to the lead block. Now you have it, it's free to wave around, it's free to engage in that creative process that you mentioned and that get to that higher spiritual level of consciousness, but it's grounded. Okay. Right. So as that shift starts to happen, it's pretty much off and on until this eclipse on election day. Yeah. And so I'm just looking here. Let me see.
Grounded and with appropriate boundaries.
Right. Because
so that discernment of being able to filter out the information that is misinformation or that is trying to lead you off course.
Well, the thing is, when the Saturn is squared by the transiting nodes, it can feel hard, right? But Saturn's mission is to make us mature, and in that maturity to allow us to grow in wisdom.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, the soul, which I'm going to assume that a lot of people listening do believe in reincarnation and that the soul has been around numerous times. But even if you don't, it's still that the soul holds the wisdom of the ages, right? Yeah. And Saturn's mission is to give us the ability to become our own inner authorities so that we can feel secure. In other words, if we ask everybody their opinions, or, you know, there's nothing wrong with that because it's all about the learning process. But in the end, we are the ultimate authority for ourselves. So when we give that authority away, we can run into issues that come up against allowing us to become more spiritually understanding of what our true soul desires. So what we want is not often what we need. And Saturn doesn't care what you want. Jupiter's like, I want this and I want that, and I'd like to move, and I want to have 18 kids, and I'm going to marry a prince and all that stuff. And or win the lottery, right, and become a millionaire. But Saturn's like, that's not what you need, dude.
Yeah. Right.
You know, so
right.
So when he squares the nodes, he's going to be more about saying, look, I might have to put some obstacles in your way. And because on the election day in 2022 with the eclipse, Saturn will again be within a degree of squaring Uranus. Mm-hmm. So if you think of it, you know, that's a square, you know, A square is tension because it's like, and that tension is inner. But when we're looking at the collective, it's manifested in the collective. So the continuation of everything you talked about already with the social, as I said before, the social progressives trying to fight against those who are like, I don't want to do away with the filibuster. Congress hasn't used inherent contempt for 200 years. Why should we do it now? You know, so anyone who follows that will know what I'm talking about. But regardless, there are the ones who hang back and the ones who want to make the changes. But the other thing that I find really interesting about that square is that if we look at it mythologically, which is to say archetypally, right? Saturn was Uranus's son. And without going into the whole long story, Uranus was, you know, trying to keep down Saturn or his other children because Uranus has a connotation with it is rebelliousness and stuff like that, but not always. It can also be just like pure Uranus Aquarius energy is going along with the group. But when there's frictional aspect, like in this case where Saturn's squaring it, it's about rebellion, right? So Saturn mythologically fought his father and won. And to me, that means that if we're looking at the Saturn-Uranus square, and it is a third quarter square, right? I know that you talked about the cycle and they're together, then they have an opening square, then they have an opposition, and then they have a closing square. So it's called the crisis in consciousness. And it's a cycle, just like everything else in astrology. So Saturn is saying, okay, well, what I'm saying is mythologically, Saturn wins. So it's kind of like, to me, the way I interpret that is that the structure will hold because Saturn is about building a foundation. It's on an esoteric level, it's the foundation within so that you can become your own best authority or your own best parent, right? Saturn's about authority figures. So we want to get to that point in our lives where we trust ourselves enough to know that we can securely make our own decisions, what to take responsibility for, what to say, no, that's not my responsibility, you take care of it. And because of the mythology, that's the part that will hold, right? So when we're looking at the election, there's other things going on there, right? I want to mention one thing, which is, as we get into this discussion, which is that, again, astrology is the study of cycles. And what happens is we can look back at the cycles in our lives. We can look back in the cycles in history. And what we will recognize, and somebody said this, and I don't know who to attribute it to, though, but history doesn't always repeat itself, but it often rhymes. So if we look back, for example, with a good astrologer to cycles in our personal charts, we can see what some astrologers, I'm thinking of Michael Luton, who specifically talks about this issue. It's the issue of recurrence. So when the energy duplicates itself in the sky that matches what's in our natal chart, we have a recurrence of that energy. So here, what I'm getting at is that we have a chart of the United States, which Marina and I both agree we use this something called the Sibley chart, which is a July 4th chart from 1776 at 5:10 p.m. in Philadelphia. And that chart is the birth of the nation. And so if we're looking at what's going to happen at this eclipse on election day, which is November 8th of 2022, we're looking at the Pluto return, which Pluto moves so slowly that an exact hit really isn't that important. It's been going on for the past year. It'll go on for another couple of years. So it's going to hit the same natal degree that this chart has for the birth of the United States. And what did we have in 1776? We had revolution. Right? So if we had revolution then, it's 248 years later. We've got some of the same themes because of the Saturn square to Uranus that were prevalent then. We have states then. We had colonies then who combined together to fight off tyranny of the British, who settled, and they weren't the only ones, but they were the ones the monarchy wanted. No taxation without representation, the Boston Tea Party, all that stuff, right? So we're having a recurrence of that energy. And that's very interesting, number one. And number two, the second recurrence is that Neptune, which takes 165 years to go around the chart, is opposing the natal the natal Neptune. So we're having a Neptune opposition by transit. And that happened last, leading up to the Civil War. Okay, so what happened at the Civil War? In the Revolutionary War, the colonies rebelled against the monarchy. And in the Civil War, the states rebelled against the federal government, and the states split in half, and we had the southern states seceding from the Union. So I'm saying that given everything that any of us who've been paying attention to the news over the last year and a half, on top of the pandemic, which of course has caused or given reason to restrictions, but the other restrictions that have occurred under the same energy is the limiting of voting rights, which I mentioned early on, the limiting of women's right to make choices about their own bodies, et cetera, et cetera. And there's more, but those are the major ones. So what we are going to be seeing is that we are having two recurrences at roughly the same time, and both of them resulted in war. So I'm not saying or predicting we're going to have a war, but I am saying that it's pretty obvious that the states are not interested in going along with a higher authority in the guise of the federal government. Now, we all have our personal beliefs about that, and that's just fine, but that's what the general energy is. So at this election, all of that is swirling around in the collective energy.
Yes.
We already had an insurrection. Do we have it again? Are we going to be able to thwart it? It really comes down, I think, to all of us deciding for ourselves where we place and in whom we place our faith. Okay. And again, Jupiter is the arbiter of that, because Jupiter says, look, you don't need science to prove something. You don't need science to prove your philosophical or religious beliefs. Okay. Right. And again, as I pointed out, our philosophical beliefs actually, I view the religion, indoctrinated religion, falls under, it's a narrower version of our greater philosophies about life. So if we rise above that, we don't get stuck in that righteousness and all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But with what was I going to say? With Saturn, it's, so one is about, what do I really believe, even though I can't concretely prove it. I just know in my heart, in my gut, in my bones that this is what I believe in, right? And then Saturn is, well, if I am secure in my beliefs, then I have a greater sense of inner security. And that helps me make my decisions on a daily, weekly, monthly, annual basis. So those two are very important, I think, because as I said, the year starts out with the node squaring Jupiter, and then later on, Saturn takes its place for a good portion of the year. And it's very, I think it's very comforting to know that we can work towards distinguishing between what we were told, taught, or forced to believe as a child, in early life, and or in past life karma, that we still think we have to adhere to because we were told, taught, or forced to believe these things by our authority figures, our parents, our clerics, our teachers, our judges, whoever you want to place in that position, right? So we want to disabuse ourselves of the notion that other people have more authority than we do for ourselves. And that's a tough that's a tough road to take. And that's why I think Saturn being squared by the transiting karmic, nodes is going to bring us some hardships, because Saturn is always related to work. Saturn and work, of course, helps us provide money in this society, which then in turn allows us to secure the foundations of our life. I always say, if you want to build a house, you need to have a strong foundation, then you can put up the walls, then you can have a roof. And Saturn's very concerned with security. So now the animals are not going to be predators because you have a secure place. You're going to lock the door, right? All that stuff. So you have a place where you can live. And then out of that develops that sense of Jupiterian faith. I'm okay. I'm going to be okay. So I would say to you, although I wasn't thinking this beforehand, it's coming to me now that, because Saturn represents work and material possessions, it also is going to factor into what we have and our finances. So securing our finances right now will be very important, because that is something that we know will make us feel secure. It doesn't matter where the finances come from. I don't care, whether you're earning it or you're on Social Security, or you're young and just starting out and being urged to open a Roth IRA, or, to invest in your 401k plan through your company. Or because we also, with the Saturn Uranus square, have seen a huge amount of people leave their jobs, right? This job doesn't give you security because it's not even minimum wage.
Right.
I know I'm going on and on, so cut me off.
Well, there's the security that there's the security that comes from money. But I think a lot of people these days are also saying, at what cost, right? What am I sacrificing of myself in order to put this money into my bank account and to have a roof over my head? And is it worth my mental health? Is it worth using the years and days of my life in a way that isn't in alignment with what my soul needs?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to say one thing, which is that the Saturn Uranus square, Saturn's in Aquarius, Uranus is in Taurus. So Uranus in Taurus is asking us to change with the times, in terms of the times or the social mores or all those things, in the collective, about what is of value. And again, not on the superficial level. Right. Oh, I like my car, I moved to a bigger house, whatever. It's about saying, just like you said, that with the rebelliousness of the square, there's a little bit of this take this job and shove it kind of, energy, because my values have changed.
Yeah.
I no longer think that I should be exhausted. I come from New York City, and in the early days, I grew up on Staten Island, which meant in the early days, you had to take a ferry boat from the northern shore of Staten Island to the southern tip of Manhattan, which took 25 minutes. So anywhere you were going to go in Manhattan after that, you just had to add a half an hour to it.
Mm-hmm.
If it took you 45 minutes from the train, or 30 minutes, or a 15-minute walk, you're still talking about a long time, and that's twice daily, right?
Yeah.
So what's happened with the Uranus and Taurus ingress since 2018, and especially coming to fruition during the pandemic, is that people's values, as Saturn starts to square, or has, started to square Uranus, it's like, my values about work are completely different. And so obviously we've seen this manifest in how many people were forced, right? Whether they wanted it, and many, many people did, and some others didn't, to work at home.
Yeah.
And now we're in the period where it's like, I ain't never going back.
Yeah. Right.
And therein lies the rebelliousnness that we're talking about, because I think sometimes when we use these words, it's hard to connect to them.
Yes. Yeah.
But it is, I think, take this job and shove it is probably the best way to put our finger on that particular energy. You know?
Well, yeah, and then I know for my kids who are in their early 20s and their friends, it is a great hardship for them to not be able to be with other people, with their peers. And
Right.
so for them, for me, it's like, oh, everybody's on Zoom. Great. That's the way I do it anyway. It just makes it easier for me. But for them, it's like they have to do their college classes over Zoom, and that's it's very hard for them to find motivation. And anyway, I wanted, but so there's that Aquarian aspect also.
I just want to say one other thing too, real quick, which is that along with that, I find it interesting because my son is 26. Mm-hmm. And so he's on the millennial Gen Z or whatever cusp, but these kids now, a lot of them, because there's been so much more entrepreneurship since their birth, right? And they go through college or whatever, higher degrees, is that like when I talk to my people my age, I'm like, oh yeah, my son's girlfriend works for a design company and she just decided to take a month off. And they're like, well, what are you talking about? And when I tell them that she gets paid for the month off because that was part of the agreement for a startup company, that they can't believe it. Like when they say how many, because when I first started working, it was like, oh, how many weeks vacation do you get? And everybody got 1 or 2. If you got 2, you were like super lucky, right?
Yeah.
But now it's like people our age can't believe that people they can take a month vacation and nobody's going to bat an eye. I mean, there may be some minor adjustments they have to make and all that. So that's a very easy way to see the change in values over the long term to get us to this Uranus and Taurus, because Taurus also has a financial connotation like Saturn, but it's like Taurus rules the second house, of resources. So, and values. So what are their values have changed, and the rest of us are like, huh?
Yeah.
Like, whoa, like when did that happen?
Right. Yes, definitely. Well, I wanted to come back to and then we probably should head toward wrapping it up, but looking at first of all, in the eclipse chart for the November 8th eclipse, there's Mars.
I got that here.
Mars is retrograde Mars is in a square to Neptune and Jupiter, which are pretty close to a conjunction at that point. So the potential for eruptions of the unexpected or violence, and also just touching on something that you mentioned, and the Civil War and the Neptune opposition in our country's history, and just how much we're having a reckoning with this foundation of racism and the foundation of slavery. And how much the transformation, and when you were talking about the cycles coming back and that history rhymes, I think of it as I've always thought of it visually as a spiral. So it's like you go around and you come back, but you're in a new, 3-dimensional, like on a spiral notebook. You're coming back to the same point, but it's different also.
But it's different, which is the history repeats, but it rhyme, doesn't repeat.
Exactly.
Well, let me say a couple of things, and I'll try to say this quickly. Number one, in the Sibley chart, which we mentioned, which is the birth chart of the United States that we agree on, there is a Mars-Neptune square. Mm-hmm. Okay. Now, Mars is the planet of the personal will, and it represents instinct. Okay. So Mars always wants us to move instinctively. And that lends itself to intuitively. I always use the example of a Native American in the forest, the boy who goes out for an initiation, 14 or whatever, and has his bow and arrow. And he has to know which way the wind is blowing. He has to listen. If he hears a twig crackle, he needs to know if it's a large animal or a small animal. He really needs to use his wits, and then he needs to act fast, because if it's a wild boar coming at him, he needs to get that bow and arrow out. If it's a rabbit, he goes, okay, good, right? So that's Mars' purpose, right?
Yeah.
So it's action, but it also has a connotation with anger. It's like motivation, ambition, and assertion. because those are normal things to have. If we're overly assertive, if we're overly aggressive, if we're overly sexual, if we're overly angry, right, or go into a rage, then we've crossed the line on the continuum. So, but Mars in frictional aspect to Neptune, because Neptune is unconscious, right? And it is very porous because it allows in the energies of the collective. For those of us who don't know that we absorb energies, or we're empaths, right? We can take in energy unwittingly, but then not know where it came from, and it can make us tired, you know, or we can make us, I find the two energies related there are grief and rage. So if we're unexpectedly angry or unexpectedly depressed or grieving, you know, these are indications that we're letting in too much of the collective's energy, and we need to start to do our meditation or our mindfulness or whatever and get back to these rituals. However, the Mars square Neptune in psychological astrology creates a huge propensity for because Neptune is always about escapism on its negative side, and Mars and also like Jupiter, I said, because Jupiter used to rule Pisces, right? It's fantasy, and so Mars square Neptune is an indication, again, on a psychological level, that the fantasy is better, okay, than the reality. Okay, I'm going to mention, because you're going to places like racism, I'm going to mention things like pornography, because Mars is connected to male sexuality. So I think we may see, I think in the birth chart of the United States, we checked out, right? And that relates to manifest destiny. And manifest destiny is a concept that there's this whole continent yet to be conquered, and we're going to be kings of our own land. Screw the monarchy. We're not paying them taxes. We're going to develop this land. It's all mine, okay? My inner authority, right? I'm working towards that. And this is a recurrence of that energy. So there may be some, if not checking out, which I think is a little too harsh way to put it, it's going to be like, what am I dreaming about that could happen? And where can I recognize that that dream is actually, you know, you wake up from a great dream, right? Not every dream is a nightmare. And you're like, oh, I wish I could make that dream real, you know?
Yeah.
So, you know, there's a waking up point with that. So we will see a recurrent, because the United States is blind to, when you talk about racism, we go back to indigenous genocide of the indigenous peoples, the Native Americans, right? When they talk about critical race theory, I laugh, because I go, where are we talking about the Native Americans? You know, not to diminish the horrible things that we've done to people of color, but we annihilated a race.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah. And that was not an easy period. That was a very bloody period. The colonization of this country is horrific when you actually read historians' accounts of it. So, you know, not second to that, but equivalent to that is slavery, and all of the horrors that are related to that. But I think with the United States, there's a disconnect, and that's the Mars Neptune. So I think we're going to have a disconnect at this election. But what worries me too is, you know, the fact that, hang on, because I'm just looking for my chart to make sure I have the right one. Because now, of course, I put them in disarray and have to. Oh, did I turn this one over here? Nope, that's the winter solstice. I got a million charts, and you know how it is.
Balloon is getting away from you.
Exactly. See, I wanted to mention just briefly too, at the Libra Equinox, which is going to be September 22nd, we're leading into the election period. We're about 6 or 8 weeks away, or whatever it is, about 6 weeks away, and Uranus is rising. Okay, so Uranus is, if we set it for DC, and it's on the North Node, so it says change is coming, right? But it's not going to be easy, because when, as you and I know, especially from Stephen Forrest's teaching, when something's on the North Node, it's bearing down on the South Node.
Right.
So the South Node is going to be under, affliction or attack or whatever. So by the time we get to November 8th, anyway, the Uranus, I'm sorry, in the Libra Equinox or the fall equinox chart rising it's coming into consciousness.
Yes.
Something has to change. And again, Saturn is within a degree of square to Uranus and therefore square the nodes. So all the things that I said about that are in play. And the leading up to the election day, there's one other thing that's real important to mention. And I'm going to just check my notes here to give you some accurate information, which is that Mars is going to enter Gemini on August 20th. And he stays in that sign until March 25th. All right. The average Mars transit through a sign is typically 5 to 6 weeks, but every 2 years, Mars stations retrograde for about 2.5 months. So his retrograde occurs between October 30th and January 11th of 2023. So we can see right away that on November 8th, Mars will be retrograde. Now, Mars retrograde asks us to go inward and find our inner warrior.
Yes, warrior, not worrier.
Right, warrior, WARRIOR, right? We all, the inner warrior you have to meditate on so you can alleviate that. But the thing is that the Saturn Uranus square will be part of the T square at this eclipse with the sun and the moon opposing themselves and factoring into the nodal configuration. So we've got Mars will be retrograde squaring Neptune, okay, which is another signature that as that aspect comes into fruition and leads us into the election, that we have to hold on to what are the true beliefs about how we can express ourselves without having to go into that fantasy, without having to say, unrealistic stuff. Oh, Trump's going to win and then he's going to whatever, or, Biden's going to run again and he's going to win and, or Kamala Harris is going to be president or whatever. Yes. It's fine to speculate. We're all going to do that because, anybody who's on Facebook, you can't avoid it. But the other thing that's important is also, and I want to give you the dates too, because it's the same period, is Mercury will square Neptune. And that's a briefer square, and it will be leading into the election, but it's not going to be square at the election. I don't think. Let me just double check. I think he'll have moved out.
Yeah. Mercury's conjunct the sun.
The south node and the sun. Okay, so he is prevalent, and he's also going to be square. He's part of the T square. Yes. Right. So we have the moon, the north node, the Taurus moon, and Uranus and Taurus conjunct in the 7th house of partnership in DC at the exact eclipse time, which is 6:02 a.m. that morning. And Venus, the sun, Mercury, and the south node are conjoined in the 1st house in Scorpio. Okay. And they're square to Saturn in the 4th house of home. We want to establish a foundation here in Aquarius, right? So the fact that Mercury is now going to be more square to Saturn, right? But prior to that, he's square to Neptune. And I think leading up to this election, we're going to see the same thing that we saw 2 years ago and 4 years before that, which is a huge amount. Here it is. Mars in Gemini squares Neptune and Pisces within 2 degrees of orb between early October and late November. Okay. And from September 28th through October 6th, it's at Mercury in Virgo squares Neptune. Okay. So Mars and Mercury are going to overlap, but Mercury squares Neptune first. Right. And that's a month before the election. So there's going to be a huge amount of misinformation and disinformation, which makes it all the more important for us to say to ourselves, with that Saturn squaring the nodes for, a good portion of the year leading up to the election, who's got what is the truth, right?
Yeah.
Because if we can't tell from the news and the information that's coming at us, then we have to rely on our own sense of faith, which is the Jupiter thing, and to say, okay, I am going to believe that the universe is benign. It has no vested interest in making any of us suffer. And rather, it gives us opportunities every moment of every single day to grow in consciousness. So how can I grow in consciousness about what makes me feel most secure without falling into the shadow side of Saturn, which is, I can't get enough to make me feel secure. I have to have more money. I have to have more possessions. I have to have more friends. I have to have whatever, more certificates and degrees and accolades and a higher reputation. People who have certificates are not necessarily the best at what they do. And
Right.
that's where the Saturn Uranus square comes in, because it's like, does he know what he's talking about?
Yeah, and I one of the things that I recommend, because we are going through these times of misinformation, and sometimes any of us are potentially vulnerable to getting misguided or misled or confused. And so how do we protect ourselves against that? If we can, and I think that the more we can stay stable and grounded in close to our own center, the more we are able to discern. And so it's when you get lost from yourself that you start to become more vulnerable to being easily deluded or persuaded.
Exactly.
So sometimes that's all we have. We don't necessarily know. And even, somebody's saying science says this and somebody else is saying, well, yeah, but science says something different. So even, it's not like you could just rely on science. It's not like you can just rely on this authority figure. Having that ability to filter and to say, okay, wait, who's saying that and how much do I trust them? And coming back to, what you're saying about trust, and you have to trust yourself before you can trust.
Well, I want to say one thing, and I know we're almost out of time, but I think it's really important because you just made me flash on it. So the transit, the ingress of the nodes going to Scorpio South Node and Taurus North Node, and the issue of scorpionic betrayal and propaganda, because Scorpio's Pluto Scorpio at the worst wants to control, and it will manipulate to get what it wants. So during this election, as there's disinformation and misinformation, which is just a continuation of the energies that we've been under for a while anyway, for different, whether they're transitory and then they pass away and then they come back or whatever, is that what I've noticed, particularly since the pandemic started, with the what you mentioned, argument between science and whatever, is that the Scorpio represents also wealth, right? And other people's money. So how much we've been deceived or lied to or manipulated, and deceit is Neptune's domain and manipulation is Scorpio's, as all these energies converge together. One of the reasons that people don't believe the science is because they don't believe the pharmaceutical industry. Right. Because this country, having gone through the opioid epidemic, nobody believes their doctor anymore. Not nobody, but a lot of people have been jaded and hurt, and and the same thing with COVID now. So we have the opportunity to dig deeply into what is, just like you said, but for slightly different, with a slightly different orientation, what is the truth based on our own sense of hope and faith, and combined with, while Mars is retrograde, going deep about finding our inner warrior, because the inner warrior there is going to allow us to move instinctively. And therefore we won't be second guessing and asking this one and asking that one. We'll just know, so we need to transform any distrust of the past few years or decades or whatever. This goes for politics too. How has the nation's military deceived us? How have the bankers deceived us? We just went through 2008 and 9 and the housing crisis and the markets and the billionaires making all the money and the rest of us having, to settle for no raise or whatever. So I'm just saying that this trust, figuring out where we've been manipulated and how to transform that in our own minds and our own hearts and our own souls to say, okay, you know what? Maybe that was true, but let me take a look at the bigger picture. Am I still pro-democracy? Am I still for equal voting rights? Am I still for women to have the right to choose what to do with their body and any other issue? Do I fear immigrants or do I embrace them? All the issues that are in. Do I want the Supreme Court to be made up of all conservatives or do I think it should be expanded and balanced? Everybody has their own opinion. But what I'm saying is cut through with this Scorpio South node for the next 18 months, starting now, to where you've learned through manipulation that you can now say, okay, I know what I trust and I know what I don't. And that will help cut through the disinformation because, disinformation lacks perspective. It lacks detail. It lacks, I noticed that Mercury is going to square Neptune from Virgo. Virgo is very detail oriented, but Neptune will obfuscate the details and make them sound like something they're not. Yeah. So that the final analysis is skewed from what it actually is factually. Yes. So all of that stuff is, I recognize that it's a lot, but I would just say to people, ground. Meditate, create in whatever way that comes to you naturally. And, just take that sense of becoming your own inner authority. And if you were bamboozled or you were deceived, okay, well, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me, right? I have to take responsibility. And I think that's pretty much what'll get us through this year. Yeah. Although I don't know how much change will happen at the election. I don't know.
Keep us on track with the evolutionary process, because that's the thing about the cycles is that they are moving forward with or without us. So we can get on board and work with this energy to create the highest possibilities, or we can fight it kicking and screaming, which doesn't generally end well for us. So.
Well, Liz Green, the Jungian psychologist, she says, change or be changed. That's Pluto Scorpio energy. And she says you can go kicking or screaming, or you could go easy. But you're gonna go.
You're gonna go. Yeah.
So you get to choose which way you want to go,
Yeah, beautiful. Oh, this has been such a powerful hour. Thank you so much, Sheri,
Thank you, Marina. This has been thank you so much. I cut you off before you got to finish thanking me, but I thank you as much and as an equal measure. So I really appreciate your having me on and allowing me this time.
Yeah. And
it's always a pleasure to talk to you.
Always a pleasure. Wonderful. And so the rest of the videos, if you missed them, are Countdown to 2022. They're available on my Facebook page, on my YouTube channel. I have a Facebook event called Countdown to 2022, where you can find all the videos to fill you in on some of the things we were talking about here. But it was just so rich to have these insights and your sharing. So thank you, Sheri, and thank you everyone for being here. Keep up the good work. You're making a difference. All right.
Namaste.
Namaste.